Hello everyone. Today we're going to have another installment for my Ghostwriter Talks About series. Today I want to talk about ways that we can get help from other authors. When it comes to learning how to write, one of the key things that people will tell you is to write. Okay, that seems obvious. Some other people, like myself, will tell you that you should be reading a lot. Okay, so we should be reading and we should be writing. Sounds good. Anything else? Well, for some of us, perhaps learning is a real journey. So we will have to really take our time to understand all of the fundamentals of writing. And this means that we will have to look to others beyond ourselves and what we are experiencing as writers. And for some of us who prefer more organized approaches to learning something, going to other authors and listening to what they have to say can be a great guide to understand what exactly we should be doing about our own writing, how we should be approaching inspiration, how we should be approaching research, how we should be approaching the very act of writing, how we should be approaching mechanics, all of these things. And there are 4 general ways that we can go out and find this information. The first, most obvious kind of way is to go for school textbooks. School textbooks tend to be helpful, informative, and practical. They will often have exercises that you can use. One of the best ways for you to figure out what textbook will work for you is to take a look at samples, to listen to people who are currently attending creative writing courses. And you can always go on Google and just take a look at what different schools are using when it comes to creative writing syllabi. So the creative writing syllabus that is handed out to a lot of students can change from year to year, and it can sometimes also be determined by the instructor's preferences. So these school textbooks may not have all the answers for you, but a lot of school textbooks are fairly comprehensive. Now, the cons to going with a school textbook is that they're expensive, they're sometimes not easy to get a hold of, and in some cases, creative writing textbooks can be affected by certain, shall we say, educational factors and standards. So just because something appears to be really solid and has a lot of pages in it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to have everything that you might be looking for, nor may it have the approach to writing or the forms of writing that you require for your particular book. An example of this would be Creative Writing: A Practical Guide by Julia Casterton. This creative writing practical guide is a book that's currently in its 3rd edition, and it stands at about $50 to $150 depending on whether you want the paperback or the hardcover. So once again, this is rather expensive, but it is incredibly practical, and it looks at a variety of forms including autobiographies, poetry, short stories, screenwriting, and longer fiction. And generally, there is some steps on how to prepare your publication or your performance. It even covers how to do research, and there are checklists and all of that that can help you with tackling the whole mountain that comprises your novel. Now, another cheaper option would be to just read a lot of what famous writers are saying. So if you go once again online and you can Google things like essential books for writing, something like that. And for example, centerforfiction.org has a neat little list. So at the top of their list is On Writing by Stephen King, Still Writing by Dani Shapiro, On Moral Fiction by John Gardner, First You Write by Joni Rogers, The Forest for the Trees by Betsy Lerner, The Writing Life by Annie Dillard, Writing Past Dark by Bonnie Friedman, and so on and so forth. Now, a lot of these are really helpful to a certain degree, right? They're sharing the author's life stories or what inspires them or what has influenced their decisions. And from that, you can infer quite a bit. So, for example, Stephen King wrote one called On Writing, a Memoir of the Craft. And basically, he writes a very interesting story about his journey to being a writer. And it's very, very fascinating. It's a very good read. The same thing could be said about C.S. Lewis's book on writing and writers, a miscellany of advice and opinions. So once again, he had like short little sections, commentaries on writing fiction, on writing for children, on writing science fiction, on writing as a Christian. So once again, C.S. Lewis had some things to say about writing. Ernest Hemingway, who is considered to be one of the most powerful influences on modern writing, wrote some stuff on writing. So once again, you can pick out your favorite author and see if they've said anything about writing. And some of these authors today still have very deep interest in really helping writers go on their own journey. So Brandon Sanderson, for example, has a great set of lectures that you can watch for free on YouTube, all about writing fantasy, sci-fi stuff. So once again, find your favorite authors, make a little list, and then go and see if any of them have had anything to say, a quote, a monograph, an essay. What have they written about the process of writing? And from these great writers, you can learn quite a bit. So very insightful, very inspiring. But the downside is that very few of them provide exercises or things that you can actually do. So in many ways, it's not so much practical as in just sharing their experiences. And as a result, if you're going to take anything away from what they're saying, you have to use inference to apply their ideas to your own writing, to your own current journey. Now, that doesn't mean that everything that's out there is either a school textbook or, a famous author. There are smaller, more specific books that you can get that are much more focused, are much more practical, still highly informative, still very helpful, and above all else, they can be quite cheap as well. So for example, The Elements of Fiction Writing, which was headed and written by Orson Scott Card, is a series that deals with various parts of writing. Okay, so if you can get your hands on them, you can get a book that's focused on voice and style, a book that's focused on description, a book that's focused on setting, on beginning, middles, and ends, scenes and structure, manuscript submission, plot, dialogue, so on and so forth. So stuff like that can literally be a very, very, very specific, very focused look at how to get started on writing. Another one, for example, once again, helmed largely by Orson Scott Card, but also by other authors and by the editors of Writer's Digest. There's this book called Writing, Fantasy, and Science Fiction. And this is a very, very helpful, very hands-on look at how to construct a world, how to build a whole world in a realistic kind of way, how to, research and get historically accurate information so that you can use it in your writing, and basically how to generate ideas and how to transform them in your own kind of way. And I think books like these that are very, very focused, very targeted on specific abilities or specific genres can be extremely, extremely helpful. There's another one, for example, where there's like something called the Creative Writing Coursebook. And this creative coursebook by Julia Bell focuses on the advice and exercises for writing fiction and poetry. So as you go through the book, you are encouraged to actually take what you've learned in the readings and apply them straight away into your own writing, or in small exercises where you are attempting targeted practice in a specific area. And I find this kind of approach to be extremely helpful, because sometimes you might feel very confident with setting, for example, but you're not so confident about writing characters or using adjectives. And so books like these can be very helpful for you to first focus on what you think you need to work on, and then go back and review other areas where you feel more confident in. Because, of course, you should always be reviewing. Another massive book that I personally own is called The Elements of Style by William Strunk and E.B. White. So E.B. White was a famous author way back in the day, okay? And William Strunk was a professor of English at Cornell University. And together they made a book that focuses on basically writing. You really can't go wrong with having this on your bookshelf. Why do I say that? Because this is all about mechanics, okay? And composition. So they focus on writing, on grammar, on very specific rules that often plague authors. And then they take a look at composition. So, for example, looking at active voice versus passive voice, concrete specific language, omitting needless words, express coordinate ideas in similar form, and so on and so forth. So all of this stuff is very, very helpful for early writers, because a lot of early writers make very, very simple errors. And it is so easy to nip this in the bud if you simply know that this is a problem. They even have like a little list with suggestions and tips in regards to style. I do think they are a little bit old-fashioned, and they probably are closer to the Hemingway school of thought in terms of writing. But still, it's very, very handy to have on your shelf as a reminder. And guess what? It's super cheap. Like you can pick this up for like $5, $10, something like that. So it's not at all super expensive, and it's really, really, really good. Now let's talk about two books that I personally really, really like. So I think Brandon Sanderson's lectures have been very, very inspiring. And that is something I do recommend. I think almost all writers should be taking a listen. But if you're really going into fantasy or sci-fi and you want to kind of bring back or experience a personal renaissance in terms of returning to more classical forms of fantasy, I highly recommend checking out Brandon Sanderson's stuff. And I will have it down in the description below so you can have a listen for yourself. But there are two other books as well that I personally own that I find to be very, very good. And one is going to have you raising your eyebrow, but I'll explain in a little bit. So the first thing that I have, and I have found to be extremely helpful, is a book called The Writer's Digest Guide to Science Fiction and Fantasy. It came out, I think, in the early 2010s or something. It's very hard to get your hands on this, so it might end up being a bit more expensive, but it is very, very helpful. So it is basically a form or very similar to what I had spoken of before. And I know I have this one personally in my library because it has sections in it that really break things down in such a way that you can actually create your own notebook and just fill in the information that you require about the world that you want to explore. So I have it on my bookshelf because if I want to write a series particularly, I really, really need to take the time to set out the world, to set out the lore, to set out the folklore, to set out the politics and everything. And I think Orson Scott Card is really on the money here. So this guide that I have on my bookshelf might be outdated, and the one that I mentioned earlier is probably the new version for it. So either way, I recommend either one, honestly. And you really should take a look at either one of these books because they cover everything that you really need to have in your story. Now, it can be very, very easy for people to get caught up in thinking, oh, I need to have this software, I need to have this program, I need to get this in, I need to get that in. Well, the truth is that a lot of people can get sucked in. They can get really sucked in to just building lore, just having a world, and not actually writing a story. It just can happen. I think it appeals to a certain kind of brain. And these kinds of brains get caught up in the minutia and they forget about having an actual narrative. So you have to approach this book cautiously and carefully, and you have to remember it's a tool for something else, which is creating a story. However, I still highly recommend having this on your shelf because it's just super comprehensive. I know that a lot of people can go online, they can look up stuff on ChatGPT or on YouTube or what have you. You could even watch some of my videos, but sometimes it's good to go analog and just turn off the electronics and just get into your world. Just get analog. And there's an inspiration to be found from taking a book off the shelf and just having fun with it. And I think this is where a lot of people might feel like, oh, I have to run out and have to get this new thing, when in fact this book could easily answer a lot of your questions in terms of what you should be covering for your fantasy or sci-fi. And this book is actually fairly priced, and it's worth the investment. Now, another book that I highly recommend, and this is going to have some people going, what? Is Stephen Fry's book, The Ode Less Traveled. Now, what a lot of people might not understand is that when writers experiment in other forms, they can learn different things, learn different techniques, and bring those techniques back into their original writing and improve as a result. And so Stephen Fry's book, The Ode Less Traveled, is really an amazing guide to writing poetry. When I found out that Stephen Fry had written a book on poetry, I was like, okay, all right. What's he got to say? Now, I had great respect for Stephen Fry. And I knew that he would have some things to share because he's a very knowledgeable individual. But I didn't realize how practical he would get. So Stephen Fry really lets you in on the ground floor in understanding poetry of all sorts, particularly rhyming poetry. And this is becoming a lost art in a sea of poetry where tons of people are just spilling their words on the page like goop in what they call free verse. Stephen Fry is here to hold the bastions of poetry writing and remind us all that we're part of an ancient tradition that has its own language and its own set of skills. What I found so fascinating about Stephen Fry's approach to talking about poetry is that unlike the other famous people that I've mentioned in this list, he is eminently practical. So most of the chapters have an exercise at the end that you can do in order to implement what you have learned. So yeah, I think Stephen Fry did a fantastic job. And if you're wondering, my writing feels a bit flat and stale, it feels a bit obvious, it feels a bit passé, my recommendation is actually to try writing poetry. Writing poetry pushes you in ways that you've never imagined. Writing poetry, in my opinion, is probably similar to playing the Wretch in Elden Ring. the ultimate form in many ways, because writing it well is incredibly difficult. Particularly if you're attempting something like a Petrarchan sonnet or very simple ballads or eulogies, can require a lot of mental muscle, because the vocabulary and the figurative language you want to leverage and all of that has to fold together into a perfect instance of experience. And therefore, writing poetry can be extremely challenging. And it is very hard for most people to get into in a very real kind of way. But once you start tackling it, I believe that, number one, poetry will help you, process certain things. There's a therapeutic side effect to writing poetry, I think, especially if it's very personal. But at the same point in time, I think there's also a way in which you learn how to pare yourself down and you focus on an experience, you focus on sensory details, you focus on being. And I think a lot of modern writers these days are either super purpley prose or they're super spare, and there's none of this beautiful pacing of emotion and sensory description. And I think writing poetry can teach you how to handle this pacing that is required. It teaches you ways to pare things down, but not too much. And it really pushes you into the world of figurative language, which a lot of writers just don't use as much as they could. So yeah, Stephen Fry's book, The Ode Less Traveled, highly recommended. In summary, for this fairly short video, I just want to encourage everyone to go find their favorite authors and see what are those authors doing. Because I think a lot of authors, particularly from the past, did have tidbits here and there where they shared their experiences, where they shared their thoughts and their inspirations. And from their words, I think you can yourself be inspired and feel more empowered to put your own story out there. And yeah, I have myself gone and done quite a bit of listening to various people or quite a bit of reading, particularly in terms of Orson Scott Card and Stephen Fry, because a lot of these folk are particularly invested in helping people in very practical ways to achieve their dream. There's no shortcuts to being a good writer, but if there's one thing that will help you overcome some of this difficulty and this trial and error, it's hearing from people who are infinitely better at it than yourself. Hear them talk about how to go about honing yourself and honing your craft. And yeah, that's pretty much where I'm at for today. A pretty short little jaunt. Next video, we're going to be taking a look at how to read as a writer. So you're reading a lot, but are you reading as a writer? So hopefully in that video, I will be able to provide a very good example and maybe a small exercise for everyone so that everyone can understand exactly what I mean by reading as a writer and by being able to analyze as a writer what is going on in a scene and break it down and understand why this works. And yeah, I hope that I can do that within the next couple weeks. We shall see. Things have been very busy in my life, and I am already planning to go traveling again. I don't know why, but I'm doing it. Dawn Trail is coming out, so for those of you who know, I play Final Fantasy XIV online, so that's a thing in my life as well. I stream every Sunday. Usually I start at 7:30, but I'm thinking about pulling it back a little bit to 6:30 or even 6. Streams are very fascinating. They're very varied in topic. We talk about writing, we talk about games. We've been watching WoW cinematics. So if any of those things sound interesting to you, be sure to pop in and say hi, ask questions, distract me. I'm very distractible. But we have great fun. So hopefully you'll all come and join us on stream, and I'll see everyone next time. Take care.